without further ado, I would just like to do a few remarks before we get started. We all know here that the Transformational Change Learning Partnership is already a large community of practice that has constantly evolved based on what its members have contributed and demanded since its foundation. A lot of you are actually even here in this call. Every annual TCLP workshop, like the one we had in last October, guided the work that all of us have been working together within this platform and constantly collected feedback about it. In that context, we wanted to find a formal space where we could share drafts of these working documents, collect your recommendations, and get to know similar initiatives you're working on regarding these topics. And having said that, excuse me, I have some echo. Thank you. Sorry. Having said that, the CEIF's Evaluation Learning Initiative and the TCLP are delighted to launch today a series of virtual workshops, or what we call working sessions. Those will happen every third Thursday of the month. And the objective is to convene a network of practitioners, policymakers, and climate advocates to further our knowledge and evidence on bringing transformative thinking and approaches to climate action. We want to continue to go beyond thinking as well and use these spaces to share what this community of practice is doing. And that is the main reason why we're starting with a highly relevant piece today for the TCLP and for achieving our transformational change, a discussion on resourcing local communities. And for that, I'm delighted to introduce Nacibe Chemor, who's here with us, part of the raw strategic team, but particularly someone that has a long history with CEIF, having been part of the TSEs, having worked for years on inclusive projects development and implementation in Mexico. So without further ado, Nacibe, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alfredo. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. And welcome everyone to the first Transformational Thursday. As Alfredo said, my name is Nacibe Chemor, and I am part of the facilitation team for the Transformational Change Learning Partnership. Also, Alfredo mentioned a little bit about, the objective of this space is basically to make our community of practice stronger. Angela, could we move to the next slide, please? And the idea is to understand better what makes climate finance transformational and to be able to develop knowledge products that are actually useful. So in the end, we really want to harness this drive within the community, the global community, towards a more disruptive and catalytic effort for climate action, and we call that transformational change. Can we advance one slide? Another one. Thank you. So today's theme goes around how to provide transformational intent to climate initiatives by channeling financial resources directly to local actors and communities. Some of you were in the past Transformational Change Learning Partnership and Transformational Climate Finance events, so you know that this topic gained a lot of interest in previous events. So we are going to explore this theme through a guidance notes that we developed. I hope that you were all able to read it. It was on the website for this event, and it will be slightly updated after this discussion. So these and other guidance notes, what they really want is to provide some framing for our thoughts and our learnings around transformational climate finance. And this is also part of the work that we have developed that includes also a paper that you might have seen around the principles for transformational climate finance. Next slide, please. So the transformational elements and the considerations in this guidance note are illustrated by a great example carried out in Kenya. Last year, we invited the implementers of this initiative to present the case in a TCLP workshop. And the experience was so rich and so compelling that we decided to take advantage of it for this guidance note. We know for sure that there are other cases out there, so I want to invite you all to increase our collective knowledge, to listen actively, and to share your experiences in the discussion section. So basically, I'm going to go really fast. Through the model of the county climate change funds, Kenya established this innovative approach of county government at the sub-national level, developing both climate legislation and climate funds to finance initiatives that were prioritized and identified by the local communities themselves, which was quite groundbreaking. So originally, these county funds focused on some of Kenya's most vulnerable populations. They wanted to support their capacities for planning and adaptation, and it eventually became so successful that they extended the scope to mitigation measures also. They scaled up to other regions, other counties, and this strategy ended up informing climate policies at the national level. This is a great example of how a framework that supports local planning and focuses global and national resources toward climate priorities at community level. So through the 4 pillars that you see on screen, they made sure that the county funds were locally managed and also sustainable at the long term. Just a heads up that we developed a more in-depth case study in collaboration with the implementers of this mechanism. And this paper will be shared on the TCLP website very soon, so keep an eye out. Hopefully our colleagues from Kenya were able to join the session today so they can provide more insights at depth because they, of course, designed and implemented this initiative. Next slide. So as we developed our guidance note around transformational climate finance, we found some transformational elements shining through the Kenya experience. For example, by prioritizing finance flows towards community levels, you really can work around vested interests and ensure that the local needs are addressed. You can redirect this sometimes more simplistic narrative of benefits sharing to actual ownership. And this for sure can strengthen decision making. This really shows how moving from a more traditional capacity building of the communities to a more effective systems change, and how these can create solutions that are sustainable at the long term. We know also that finance flows are very much embedded in institutional norms at global levels. So projects like this really make an effort in decentralizing implementation and also challenging imbalanced power dynamics. Next slide. So we try to identify some considerations that can be perceived as transformational in key moments of the project lifecycle. I'm going to try my best to go through them in the limited time that we have right now, and then we can open them up for discussion. So in the conception and design phase, we found, and this is not a surprise for anyone, I think, understanding the local context is key. In the Kenya case, since the county funds were designed with the Kenyan context and the Kenyan vulnerabilities in mind, the mechanisms were able to scale to national levels while still responding to local realities. Also, the local planning committees, which were a structure of the project, they had these very strict criteria for inclusion that covered gender, people with different abilities, youth, and these allowed for not only better accountability, but in the end for a more solid and efficient program. Also, in the implementation phase, we identified several transformative elements. For example, sharing decision-making at all the appropriate levels, they call it devolved decision-making, all the way to the local level. This can provide realistic perspectives and can elevate the voices of the people who get impacted the most. Also, the local committees in Kenya were informed. I mean, they had certainty of resource allocation, and this definitely generates trust. It increases participation and eventually can help them prioritize their activities better, not only in an annual, but also in a multi-annual fashion. Another interesting element was this back and forth sharing of information between communities and the meteorological department in Kenya. And this created for more solid information systems, more updated, and eventually for initiatives that can respond better to environmental vulnerabilities and make a better use of the often, sometimes, limited resources, right? Many here will agree that the right partners are key for transformational results. So as the Kenya case shows, and many more cases, I'm sure, a nice combination of civil society, private sector, public institutions, and international actors can create solid results. But it is so important that each of them has a drive and a mandate to explore creative, non-traditional transformational approaches. Another element that we identified is the need to have, all the way from the local level, some solid principles around sustainability, equity, and inclusion on which our project can scale up, but have that beforehand agreed within the multi-level stakeholders that we are working with. And related to this a little bit, one key lesson from the Kenya experience is to provide spaces for learning by doing, as they call it, a phased implementation. This was critical for the county funds mechanism, having donors agreeing to take risks and wait and evolve at the same time while the planning process was being developed on the ground. And finally, an adaptive approach for learning and monitoring definitely increased project effectiveness. In the Kenya case, the data came from the ground via the planning committees, and it was shared more efficiently, faster. The information is now public, so it increased transparency, and it allowed information systems to advise not only the implementers from the ground, but also eventually national policies and in the end, international donors. So I mentioned before that about the transformational impact of having the right allies. And if we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. Because they can definitely, if we have the right partnerships, they can contribute with the right resources, the right expertise, that the right finances. And we found through analyzing the Kenya case study and other literature review that a good practice is to carry out multi-level stakeholder analysis that cover all the regions and all the areas and all the levels that we're working with, and eventually develop a capacity building component that can allow to cover any gaps needed or any gaps that we find. Of course, we have to think about how to balance the power dynamics and not do capacity building for capacity building, but also be very aware of what the needs and priorities at the local level are. And finally, another element that emerged is, because right now the people in the room right now, we care and we have heard about these topics, but how can we communicate about our project in a way that makes sense for the external communities that are not involved in our project? One important thing was to openly share among all the parties involved about our goals, about the progress towards those goals, and of course about our challenges. And also to find the right systems to report the progress, how we measure them, and how do we report internally and externally, because this ensures not only transparency, but also makes sure that we have an uptake of our lessons for a more long-lasting, more transformational impact. I'm going to stop here. Apologies if I went too fast, but we have limited time and we really want to allow space for further discussion. Can we move to the next slide, please? Great. So I'm going to move on to the plenary discussion. I hope that you all had access to the guidance note. And as I said, we're going to have the Kenya case study available shortly. But what we really want to do here is to try and test if our guidance note needs some further, clarification, improvements, if the sections that we developed on this guidance note make sense for project implementers, for donors, for MDBs, and also if the considerations that I just mentioned around transformational impact or transformational intent also make sense, or if throughout your own experience, you have found other elements that you discovered eventually drove your initiatives and your projects towards transformational impact. Let me just open the chat here to see if there are questions.
There was one question, Nacibe, from Ian about whether decision-making was at the county level, the country level, both.
Yeah, well, I hope there are some of our colleagues from Kenya to have some responses at a more deeper level. But as we understand while we were helping with the case study, is that both legislation and decision making were happening at the county level, because this project started in one county and then it sort of evolved to cover more counties and eventually became a national policy. But when the project was being developed in 2013 to 2018, I think, the decisions were happening at the county level, and then the funding criteria was happening at the county level, and the project selection was happening with feedback or inputs from the different communities. I hope that answers your question. Okay, I don't see any more questions.
Nacibe, we actually do have a hand raised from Dennis.
Yes.
Dennis.
Yes, thank you. How do you understanding when you say effective stakeholder engagement? Because according to from the point of view of the indigenous peoples, and taking into account the UN Declaration of Indigenous People Rights, the statement is that indigenous people have the full and effective participation. Full and effective participation means that people got to participate from the very beginning of the project design and in the implementation and the evaluation, but not as a consulting, but a truly participation. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis, and I completely agree. I can talk about one of the highlighted elements of this project is that the committees that were deciding on the project were created in a democratic fashion. They were selected from the communities, like members of this communities were members of the communities that were going to eventually be the beneficiaries of the project. So they knew firsthand what were the needs and the challenges and the financial requirements for that particular county. But again, if there are some of our colleagues from Kenya, I mean, they're more than welcome to join. And yes, Daruna, the idea for this plenary discussion is, I mean, we if we can break it in two, we would like some guidance on the guidance note and to hear from you once that you read it, what did you think about it? And if there are some improvements that need to happen, some considerations, and also in terms of content, what are some principles that you have experienced or that you have observed within your own work that have proven to be transformational during the design phase, during the implementation, and during the evaluation phase of your own projects? And I would want to encourage for everybody, maybe if we can take the slides down, Angela, and we would like to encourage everyone to turn on your cameras. Oh, hi, Anna. I see some faces. Hi, Scott. And to raise your hand and to participate